Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you may be here today on August 26th. Welcome to the MyGuru Online GRE Classroom. My name is Stefan, and I am MyGuru's Director for Online Tutoring. And today we're going to talk about the GRE issue essay. We'll give folks a couple of minutes here to continue to join, and we'll probably get started at around 9:35 Central Time. 9:35 Central Time. We'll go ahead and get started, having given a 5-minute kind of buffer for folks to arrive. People, I'm sure, will continue to arrive, and this all will be recorded and sent out to all attendees and registrants afterwards as well. Please feel free to post questions in the chat box as well during the session. And so that'll probably be the primary way that we will interact with participants during the session. Of course, you can open up your microphone if so inclined, but most folks tend to prefer to ask during the or in the chat box, just to be a little bit less disruptive during the presentation. So, as I mentioned at half past, we are going to be discussing the GRE issue essay here. First, we'll just talk about the analytical writing portion of the GRE overall to start. So the GRE analytical writing assessment. So this is always going to be the first section, and it's going to be 60 minutes total. And you have two essays that are going to be issue and then argument in that order. Today, we're going to be focusing on the issue essay. The argument essay and the issue essay definitely have two distinct tasks that you have to differentiate. And you get a maximum of 30 minutes to complete each essay. So while it's 60 minutes in total, you aren't able to reallocate time from one essay to the other. So for instance, if you finish the essay in 25 minutes, you're not allowed to have then 35 minutes to complete the argument. It's always 30 minutes maximum. You can skip and kind of punt on the essay a little bit early if you're so inclined, if it's not something that is. Now, the scoring for the analytical writing assessment is going to be on a scale of 0 to 6 in half-point increments. And basically, a 4 is going to be the 57th percentile. A 4.5 is going to be, and we'll say about the 57th percentile. It's always possible that I'm off by like 1 or 2 percentiles. I pull this off the top of my head from the last time I looked at their data. It also changes over the summer. But then you're looking at about an 82nd percentile for a 4.5. A 5 is going to be about the 92nd percentile. And a 5.5 is going to be about the 98th percentile. And a 6 is going to be the 99th percentile. And the thing to recognize is that getting a 6 on the GRE essay is the hardest thing on the exam. So while the essay probably doesn't matter to a lot of you, there are applications of it. For instance, I can think of one student in particular who was seeking a PhD in literature or was applying for a PhD program in literature at an Ivy League program, and they said they wanted a 5.5 or a 6. And I went, yes, you will need that. Everyone else is kind of at a 4. The 4 is kind of is where you really want to aim, and you just want a decent running to get a 4. Not going to need a like ridiculous amount of text. You really just want a solid essay. So this is usually the goal for most applicants. So that's kind of how you can think about the scoring of this. Again, that 4, if you get above a 4, you're pretty much golden for just about anything outside of, PhD in literature at Ivy League university. And everything else obviously is great. And you can, I'd say, prep yourself for a 4.5 or a 5 by just focusing on what you have in your essay from a rhetorical perspective, from a argumentative perspective, a planning perspective, a brainstorming perspective. We're going to talk about all these things here in a moment. But really, to get to that 5.5 or 6 level, a lot of it is volume and just the amount of prose that you're able to produce in 30 minutes. So there were literally speed writing exercises to aim for a 5.5 or a 6. Probably not necessary, but any questions about the essay section overall before we move to the issue essay specifically? All right. So just kind of continuing along in the infinite whiteboard here, I'm going to drop in an actual essay prompt here for an issue from ETS. And the first just what the graders care about, because that is important to know. And the big thing is that it is really ordered in what the prioritize. So literally the big ticket items are going to be these two up top. So that means make sure you address the task and that you actually consider the complexities of the issue, meaning that you consider both sides of it. So these are by far most important as your grader considers the essay that you produce. It pains my journalism degree to admit this. Least important by far is controlling the elements of standard written English. And so the goal of a good 4, because again, that's usually the goal for most students, is don't try to do too much. Make sure that you respond to the task, you actually prove mastery of understanding the issue. Obviously, you'll want to do the 2 that I haven't highlighted here: organize, develop, express your ideas, support the ideas with relevant examples and reasons. But it's all about making sure that you can impart to your essay grader that you understand the issue at hand. So your job is to not be over too much, and we're going to give you a very standard kind of approach to working through the essay from a timing perspective, from a organizational perspective, because you just want a 4. You just want to make sure that you're in the top half. And again, for most use cases, and that includes certainly MBA use cases. So if you're using the GRE as a replacement for the GMAT by far cares least about the essay. And the GRE essay is significantly a harder scoring scale than the GMAT. So think of the 4 on the GRE as basically being equal to a 5 on the GMAT. And anybody who's dealing with the GMAT will tell you that a 5 is absolutely sufficient for that application. So then let's talk about to manage our time for this. So we're going to have our issue, well, and really it's all essays, so both essays. So our essay pacing overview here. So we know it's 30 minutes, and the first thing that we're going to want to do is brainstorm. So we're going to spend 3 to 5 minutes brainstorming. Then we're going to spend somewhere around 22 to 25 minutes writing the essay. And you want to leave somewhere around 2 to 3 minutes for proofreading. And we'll talk about the brainstorming here in a moment with this particular issue to kind of illustrate how to work through it your issue essay. But for proofreading, you just want to fix major errors and vary word choice. You're not going to rearrange anything majorly with your proofread, but you want to have the proofread. There's always the capacity, pardon me, to leave out a sentence or a clause or a word or a phrase that was imperative for articulating the meaning as you intended it on these essays. So always allow yourself that opportunity to proofread. Also, that'll make sure that you have a decent structure and you actually get to a conclusion. If you're trying to leave 2 to 3 minutes for proofreading, you're probably going to get through your conclusion. And finishing on time is important here as well. And while we'll do more detail on the brainstorming, you can keep your notes in the word processor so that you could just kind of write around them as you go along. So you don't have to take your notes handwritten, take them in the computer, and then you can basically outline your essay that way and build in through the typing, which is going to go faster than handwriting for just about everybody at this point in time. So any questions about the pacing before we talk about how we're going to brainstorm for the issue essay in particular from the abstract perspective before we use this example that we just pulled out? So then I'm just to over here, and we're going to talk about the issue essay brainstorming. So issue essay. So step 1 is going to be to identify the issue at hand. And literally almost verbatim. So one of the things on this exam, how severe will you get penalized if you can't finish on time? So we had a question. So if you cannot finish on time, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will have lower than a 4. Actually, the example that the GRE itself uses in their official guide to the GRE book that I'd highly recommend if you're considering taking this exam, their example of a 4 actually doesn't finish. Their conclusion is abbreviated. It like stops mid-sentence, not mid-word. So it's going to keep you from getting a 5 or a 6, certainly. There's no question about that. It won't necessarily keep you from getting a 4, but it doesn't help. And having the structure and time management piece handled can certainly help you get over that 3.5 hump that you really want to clear, because that again is for most people what is going to be required for this. So any follow-up questions about finishing? All right. So when you identify the issue at hand, you want to do so almost verbatim because you will need to state it in your introduction. So you cannot just say abstractly the issue, the question. You have to make sure you articulate it because your essay grader cannot assume anything about you as a writer. So you have to make sure that you know what the issue is and you get the specific issue as opposed to addressing something tangential. So always identify the issue at hand first. Then you want to consider supporting examples, pro and con, for the issue. And there are going to be 4 kind of stock places that you can generate your supporting examples. So those could be historical events, literature, and yes, even popular culture. So sometimes what I recommend to students is to just have a few large concepts in these categories in mind so that you can apply it to a bunch of different um, potential tasks, because all of these tasks are supposed to be pretty broad when it comes to the issues, and they're supposed to be defensible from each side. So just kind of using some examples that past students have used frequently. So for instance, for a historical event, excuse me, you can certainly use World War II, right? So we'll take a look at our example, and that may come up here in a little bit. Obviously, current events, i.e., pandemic, or modern politics, however you want to phrase that. Arts and literature, this can be like popular books that you may remember from high school or college. So maybe you're big into Dickens, right? I could potentially use Dickens, or I could use say Hemingway, or even say an old movie. You could use, or an older movie, I guess. They're still current as well. You could say something like what's a good, if you wanted to use arts and literature. We'll just go for whatever reason, Apocalypse Now is on my mind this morning. So you can pick whatever you like out of there, as long as you know it and you feel like you can explain the story pretty quickly. That's going to be great. And then popular culture, the most recent, most current kind of thing that shows up over and over again in my current students is Harry Potter. Harry Potter can basically be applied to everything, or Star Wars as well. And they're back again. Used to be my arts and literature example, but now they're back again. So something else. So you can use anything that you know, and so you can kind of prepare topics or subject matter well for possible use. And so you're just like, okay, I know Lord of the Rings, or I know Gossip Girl. That's another one that came out, TV show from a while ago. It really doesn't matter, as long as you've got a somewhat encyclopedic understanding of it. You just have them, and you're trying to come up with what the pro and cons are for the issue. And the better known is going to be better than lesser known, and broad is better than obscure, so, or limited, better way to put that. So you want to have your prepared example be applicable to a bunch of different things. So you're always going to prefer something that's better known, something that's lesser to something that's lesser known, something that's broad preferred to something that's limited. And when you're thinking about hypotheticals, so this is just a note about hypotheticals. Hypotheticals should be general, not specific, because a specific hypothetical is what is known as a straw man. And any straw man argument, if you create it too specifically for your specific situation, someone else can come up with an equally specific and limited option and go, well, what if this crazy scenario happens that completely destroys your crazy scenario? So if you have to use hypotheticals, again, we prefer to use concrete examples from these four categories. You definitely want to go with just generic, less so than overly specific. So then step 3 is going to be to, based on your supporting examples, you want to choose your side. So you're basically going to consider pros versus you derived in your brainstorm, because you don't want to predetermine. So do not predetermine your position on belief. And this is, again, a very easy way for folks to actually end up with this exam, because what you end up with is a situation where there's basically you have your position, and then you're providing more examples counter to your position than actually in support of your position. And that just happens because you, for whatever reason, didn't have the greatest of examples for the position you actually believe in that moment. And that's because you don't have time to research. So you will never be held, to defend in like a real life situation or a court of law, whatever your GRE essay is. You're just going to be asked to make sure that it matches your position, like, or that your examples match your position there. So you don't want to actually choose what you believe. You want to choose what you can support, at least in the context. So, any questions about the brainstorming process here? All right. So, again, in the abstract, we'll look at it first before we go into looking at the specific example that I've got right here. We're going to talk about our issue essay structure. So it's going to be a 4-paragraph essay. And that in and of itself is usually a bit of a surprise for most people considering the GRE essay, because everyone, at least in the US, at some point seems to have been told that you need a 5-paragraph essay. You do not need a 5-paragraph essay, so use a 4-paragraph essay, and this will help you finish out your essay on time. So what you need, of course, first is going to be an introduction. And in the introduction, you must articulate the issue or the point at issue. You want to preview your support for your position, and you want to clearly articulate your position. And here, don't equivocate. So what that means is you do not want to say, well, sometimes this is right, sometimes that is right, sometimes this could happen, sometimes that could happen. You will address the opposition to some degree in your actual essay, but you're not going to want to equivocate to such a degree, because if I just scroll to the right, ask for you to write a response in which you discuss the extent to which you agree or disagree with the claim. And one other thing to note about this is that first person is okay here because you're being asked to do it yourself. And that also can be sometimes a bit of a relief that you're being asked to do something yourself and you don't have to do it in the weird, awkward third person. So you will take a position and say, this is what I believe. And that's what the task is asking. So addressing the task is always good. Any questions about the abstract introduction? So then the second paragraph is going to be your primary. How many words are usually okay for a 4+ essay? The amount of words you need to get across your point. So you got a question about how many words are usually okay for a 4+ essay. It is not about word count at all. I can say that unequivocally. Get 4 paragraphs. 4 paragraphs, roughly 4 paragraphs of 3+ sentences each. But is that absolute? No. And your grader will never use a word counter. So word count is irrelevant unlike a 5 or above, and and really, because if you are, you have to have enough words to like actually do all of the things that I'm talking about in the structure, right? You've got to actually say what the point is. You've got to say what your support is, and you're going to have to clearly articulate your position. That's basically 3 sentences right there. Potentially a little bit more if you want to be more florid, but they will never count your words. And the only reason the word count is irrelevant unless seeking a 5+, because for a 5+, you're going to need more than 4 paragraphs. And not even a 5+, a 5.5+. Good question, though. Any other immediate questions? So our second paragraph is going to be our primary supporting example. So you want to briefly summarize your supporting example. Then you want to relate the example as relevant to your position as stated. So you said, here's my position. So you can say, here's how my supporting example supports that position. But then you also want to briefly address the possible opposition response to your example's relevance to your position. But restate your position as preferable. So you're basically saying, well, I know that they could look at this and say that, sometimes blue is better than red. But I'm saying that because my example, red is actually better than blue, even if there might be this limited exception, red is still generally better than blue. So you just have to briefly talk about the opposition within each of your supporting paragraphs. And then you want to transition into the secondary supporting example. And this part right here is really how you're getting to the 5+ range. It's through transitions and flow and rhetorical coherence that your issue essay will get above that 4 range. So you just want to go, here's my next thing that I want to talk about. And almost everything for paragraph 3 is going to be the same as paragraph 2. So you got your secondary supporting example. There we go. So again, you're going to briefly summarize that supporting example, relate the example is relevant to your position as stated, address that opposition, say that your example is still preferable, and then you want to transition into any additional supporting examples you might have, or the conclusion. And this is where you're going to have to decide if you want to keep more, and this ultimately will come in your brainstorming. You'll be like, oh, I've got other examples that I can throw into the conclusion, or I just want to get out of the essay because I'm running out of time, right? So if you're running out of time, don't worry about the additional supporting examples, just get to the conclusion. But paragraph 4, either way, is going to be your conclusion. And in the conclusion, you want to briefly identify any additional supporting examples you brainstormed, relate as tangentially relevant to your position, and then just restate your position as preferable to the opposition for the reasons you stated. It's not going to be like overly clever. It's not going to be overly florid. It's just going to be a basic style conclusion here. But that's it. Get to a solid 4 is just get those 4 paragraphs in, show that you've got a overall coherent thought process around the issue at hand. And you can see the introduction and conclusion are definitely secondary to the body paragraphs, but they've got information in there that's new. That's really why, again, if you're able to get that additional supporting examples in, that'll put you towards the 5+, because you're like, oh, I also had this other thing about Hemingway that I didn't have time to get to, but it's relevant, and I can show you that I've got even more using their an understanding of the complexities of the issue. Any questions about the essay structure before we move into actually using this essay to first brainstorm and then kind of work through just a couple of brief things around how to structure a theoretical essay? So if we're good there, what I'm going to do is just underneath here, I'm going to put our brainstorm. So this is going to be sample issue essay brainstorm, not brainstorm. So with this, first we need to, I was told to avoid adding new unexplored examples in a conclusion. You're not going to want to spend a lot of time, but it is a nice way to, and you're not going to leave them unexplored. You just say other additional things. I don't necessarily know what the term unexplored is, so I've got this. I was told to avoid adding new unexplored examples in a conclusion. And here, I would tend to disagree, because this, if you're told what you're told for an academic application is not necessarily real for the GRE. So for at least the GRE, that is, because here you just want to show I know all of these different things that we could talk about for this specific content area as quickly as I can because I got 30 minutes. If you're talking about an academic essay, I absolutely agree. You can't just have like new ideas at the end of your essay. So examples not mentioned earlier in the body of an essay. Again, I would just disagree. And as somebody who's done this a lot, I would say that you've got to be careful that you don't go too deep into it. But if you wanted to just briefly say, for instance, looking at this, that the best way for society to prepare its young people for leadership in government, industry, or other fields is by instilling in them a sense of cooperation, not competition. Well, if you're like, you know what, I'm saying cooperation, and I just want to mention Steve Jobs at the very end, and you say, well, look at Steve Jobs, you couldn't imagine Apple as a company without a lot of cooperation. You don't really need much more than that. So you can definitely use brief additional examples that you brainstormed in that conclusion, provided that you constrain them really tightly like that. Any other questions about that idea of adding final examples? My pleasure. My pleasure. So yeah, it's different than any other essay that you've ever done, and I agree that you wouldn't just, kind of summarize Steve Jobs' life in a sentence for, an actual academic essay. But here, your grader is going to go, okay, yeah, you've got an idea that, for instance, again, you're looking at government, industry, or other fields. Maybe you do government, maybe you do the military, and you're like, I don't have time to get to industry, so let's just throw Steve Jobs in there. And go, oh, you clearly have industry as well, because no other essay is constrained by 30 minutes. So sample issue essay brainstorm. First, we have to identify the conclusion, the issue at hand. So what is the issue at hand in this prompt? So can anyone tell me what the issue is at hand? Kind of gave it away, I figure, with my little discussion about Mr. Jobs. So basically that idea that best way to prepare youth for leadership is by preparing to cooperate rather than compete. So again, you do a light paraphrase, you're not going to um, you're not going to get too far away from what they're saying, because you've got to get that idea of its youth, leadership, and that they, wherever it is, its cooperation is better than competition. So then all we basically two bullets here. So first is going to be agree and disagree. And this is where we're going to come up with our examples from the list before of historical events, current events, arts and literature, popular culture. So can anybody give me an example? Can anyone provide an example from real life to support agreeing or disagreeing with the statement? Because remember, we don't want to pick a side until we've got our support. So can anyone come up with, again, whether it's a television show that you're familiar with or a historical event, current events, just to say that it's better to prepare the youth? The extreme case of Rwanda, okay? And I would have to say that that probably would be a great. If you, and this is certainly, and I'm assuming that we're talking about the Rwanda genocide there. Uh, that would seem to show that it's better to agree or to cooperate than compete. And I'm honestly thinking that you may have won the argument there just by that example, right? And you then probably would go with just something slightly less extreme, but any others, any other support, disagree, competitive environment, free market, sure. So we've got free market, Adam Smith. Any others? Well, and here's the beauty of it is I've got someone who's recommended companies in the U.S., Tesla, Google, and etc. Are Tesla, Google, etc. disagree or agree? Because you can see how wide of a berth you have for your position. Because I would posit that you can actually say either. I mean, if you want to say, like I did with Steve Jobs, that you can't build the iPhone. I mean, sure, you need a strong leader potentially, but you can't build the thing without cooperating across the board. So, I mean, I would say that you could even position it as the American enterprise. That could be agree for Tesla / Google. I can spell Google. Or you could say that it's a disagree because it ties into that free market idea. So you can see how broad this can work, and it's just about you taking your position. Don't let your and taking your position based on the examples that you can come up with. Don't let your own, prior beliefs, at least in this instance, color your essay, because it is going to sometimes be more difficult to come up with your exact desired essay, and because you're constrained by having to just do this in such a short period of time, that you're going to have to, be a little bit more flexible in how you produce the essay. Any others? Any other examples, pro or con? Napoleon. And again, as a French citizen, I would have to say Napoleon can be either pro or con because he was a very competitive leader, and you also would have to acknowledge that he ended up on Elba twice. Because there's French people that may or may not agree with him being, a great thing as far as a leader. So again, just and obviously I didn't prepare any of this stuff. It makes me chuckle about Napoleon because there's not too many times that the emperor of my ancestors shows up in these sorts of discussions, but definitely can go either way, right? And that's the point, is that you just have to take a position and stick to it, and you don't want to equivocate. You want to make your position known and stick to it. But any questions about the brainstorming process here? Because I'd say that after getting just this much done, and you can see that we can probably do this in a, say, 3 to 5 minutes. It's not that hard to come up with 3 examples. And you just pick a side at this point. You go, whichever side I want is the one I'm going to go with. And so once you've got this set up, and to kind of go through again a very brisk structure here. So we'll have sample, issue, essay, outline. Here we just say, the point at issue is that, is it best to prepare youth for leadership by giving sense of cooperation or with cooperation or competition. And so you say that, you just set up and this will be here. So we set that up and we just start with the point at issue. And then you're just going to preview the pro or con examples and then state your position based on those examples. And seeing just how kind of the conversation is going on here, have some pro, some con. It can go either way. It's perfectly fine. Both positions are always going to be defensible for these issue essays. Then our primary support, or just body one, you just want to highlight, briefly summarize that primary support. So whether it's Rwanda for the pro, or sorry, for the con, or no, agree is agree, cooperation. So agree, or we could have free market or disagree. That would be, either of those would be fine. And then you just kind of explain that relevance. Ideally, you want to briefly address the opposition position. Address the opposition. And you just say things like, while, and it's harder probably for me with the genocide example to say there was a way to explain that. And you go, well, maybe that a strong leader doesn't have to always do what happened in Rwanda, right? That maybe that competition doesn't have to always go that way. Maybe competition is better, but obviously you agree that the genocide was bad. And then for the free market, if you're talking about just competition driving innovation, you could again say that there may be many people involved in the example, whatever company it is, but say that still it needs to be driven by the individual on top. And ideally, you want to transition into the secondary support. And then body 2 is basically going to be the same as body 1. You want to transition into the conclusion. And then in that conclusion, you just want to, again, briefly mention any additional examples you brainstormed for comprehensive, well, to illustrate comprehensive understanding of the issue. Restate your position as preferable to the opposition based on the information stated. And that's pretty much it. You can see, kind of exposition ultimately with this, but it's a pretty standard essay. And to be perfectly honest, if you execute this essay, this 4-paragraph essay well, you can certainly get a solid 4, if not even a 5 on the essay. The only thing that you kind of run into trouble with this structure is going to be if you're aiming for a 5.5 or a 6, because you probably just need more text, and that's speed writing drills. But that's pretty much the overall summary of how to approach the issue essay. We'll just open it up. Open Q&A for any issue essay questions. So, any questions after looking at this kind of run through? Writer's block. So I got a question, tips for writer's block. And the flow, that's always going to be there, unfortunately. And that, again, is me as somebody who's got a journalism degree that I don't use. I certainly am familiar with the idea of writer's block. The way that you manage the writer's block is by having your prepared, your prepared example, right? So for instance, and again, this is just because it's top of mind and I know it like not well, but I think the fact that I don't know it well makes it a better example. For instance, if you know Harry Potter, you can apply Harry Potter to just about everything that the GRE will ever present. So if you are a big Harry Potter fan and you're like, well, I'm looking at this issue of is it best to prepare the youth by giving a sense of cooperation or competition? Well, Harry Potter is going to lead right into that. Honestly, you could go either way. Say that, again, Harry needs to cooperate or he needs to compete against the other houses, I think it is. So the best cure for writer's block is preparing stock example sources, at least for the GRE, right? So for the GRE, it's having those stock example sources of being like, I know I've got this, and also recognizing that you don't have to wait for the perfect example, just some examples, right? Like, that I would not have come up with Rwandan genocide, and it might seem extreme, but if that's what pops up into my head, I go, well, that's what I'm going with. And you can make a good enough essay around it. You just kind of have to go, and whatever comes up, you just want to make sure you're coming up with those examples. And then you may, come up with more examples, choose the best one, and let the examples drive everything for this essay. Good question, though. Any other questions? So if you're running out of time, I would sacrifice the conclusion, but again, the main thing that you can't do is, so someone asked if running out of time, which part of the essay is best to sacrifice? Sacrifice the conclusion. Sacrifice the conclusion. And the main key here is never sacrifice the brainstorming. By brainstorming, you make your essay go faster. You'll know where you're going, and you won't run into a situation where you've written an essay and your conclusion doesn't match the introduction, which is actually worse. So if you have to sacrifice the conclusion, in some, and I'll give you just kind of an inside tip. If I were talking with a student who needed a 5.5 or a 6 or even a 5, what I'll often say is it'll be introduction, body 1, body 2, body 3, and then conclusion. So you can get 3 examples in. But if you have to sacrifice one of the examples, do so. If you've got to sacrifice the conclusion, do so. It's going to be hard if you don't have at least 3 paragraphs, and really hard if you don't have 4. So this essay, there's not much to sacrifice, but if you had to, I'd sacrifice. Time for one more question. So I got a question about how important transitions are. That's the stuff that gets you to a 5 or a 6. And ideally, the transitions are what create that flow. So transitions, another thing that you can sacrifice. You can't sacrifice the brainstorming. You can't sacrifice the examples, because those, like organization, development, and expression, along with the elements of standard English, that's the stuff going from one example to the next example and transitioning. It's nice. It's a want to have, not a need to have. So transitions are less important than the main ideas and more of a 5+ concern in general. So I've been thinking about how Harry Potter would be relevant to econ topics. My weak topic since the beginning of the webinar. So how Harry Potter would be relevant to econ. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the econ topic would be necessarily, but I mean, I think there's like some lady that comes in and like takes over the whole thing. I mean, I don't believe, I can't remember. I think there's one where they sell something, but there's if you know that that specifically is a weak topic, I'd try to think about an economic example. And again, remember, you probably want to have like one from each. So maybe Harry Potter doesn't work there, but you're more familiar with, current events, and you go, well, the pandemic's had a whole lot of economic input or impact. So it it's it's impossible, unfortunately, to prepare perfectly because you don't know what the prompt is going to be. So just have a few examples, and usually one example from each category is ideal. So one prepared. So meaning the current events, arts and literature, historical events, and popular culture, because usually you should be able to find something. Well, I thank everyone for coming here this afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on where you are. Our next one will be in a couple of weeks. I've got to remember what the topic is. I believe. Oh, I'm trying to remember. Oh, I can't remember. It's on the website what the next topic is in 2 weeks. And if you're interested in that one and any others, we will be running these through October at the very least on a bi-weekly interval. And if you have any questions, please email me directly at smanier@myguruedge.com, and I'd be happy to answer. So thank you for joining here today, and I look forward to potentially getting updates on your GRE journeys as you complete them. Have a great day, everyone.